infinite complacence, people went to and fro over the earth about their little affairs, serene in the assurance of their dominion over this small, spinning fragment of solar driftwood, which by chance or design man has inherited out of the dark mystery of time and space.
I've been listening to the show for, I've listened a year and a half now. I started listening, actually, funnily enough, during the first portion of the pandemic, 2021, and just have been avid ever since. And I finally was like, I started connecting the dots in my own mind, and I was like, oh, it's got any stories? And then recently I was like, maybe I should just sort of have a think about what has happened. And I started writing a list, and I was like, okay, I think this warrants me reaching out. So here we are.
Well, yeah, and you utilize the new, what is it called, a speak pipe, which works really, really well. I got rid of the hotline because, I don't know, maybe it's something about calling a hotline. I thought, well, maybe if they just had to hit a button and talk into, I don't know why that would be different, but maybe but anyway, that worked really well. The audio quality is good on that. And we're using Skype, which, by the way, when Skype works, of course, when, as you say, the gremlins aren't trying to conspire against us, they're just, nothing beats Skype. I mean, you're in the UK, and listen to how that, well, you don't know, but it sounds amazing. It just sounds incredible. So a part of me is kind of going, I should really require guests to do it, because the cell phone quality now is so bad. And also, you're one of my patrons. Thank you so much for that.
No problem. No, pleasure.
Okay, so Ed, first of all, welcome to the show. Obviously, it's wonderful to have you on. You are from my original neck of the woods. Don't remember a lick of it, so that's why anytime anybody contacts me from across the pond, I'm very excited about it. So, yeah, welcome on the show.
No problem. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Do you want to start, early on, maybe family history, and work up to the recent times, or would you rather work backwards? How would you rather do this?
I'll start at the beginning, I guess, with a little bit of history. I don't know to what degree it informs everything that's happened, but I suppose it's more that it's just an interesting preamble, and people can connect the dots however they want, really. But I think I said to you, in my messages that I left that. So I'm half Irish. My mum's parents are Irish. She was born in the UK, but they're both from Ireland, County Westmeath and County Tipperary. I originally said it was both on my mum's side, but I since found out that it's my mum and my grandmother and my grandfather's side, both her parents. My grandmother, my mum's mother, but like devout Catholic, but as with all things, it transpires that she was a fortune teller, and she used a system I've since learned is called the Lenormand system. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Is where it's not using tarot cards or sort of conventional divination. It's playing cards. It's based around the playing cards. So slightly different system, slightly different sort of number of cards, etc., etc. And she did that to great effect. I've been informed by my mum. She said that when she was a child, it was like a revolving door, people coming in and having their fortunes read, repeat customers pretty much. So I've got a history of that on my grandmother's side. And my mother's father, on his side, his mother, so my great-grandmother, was a faith healer. So she, again, devout Catholics, but, I guess the old habits die hard. She used to cure people with laying on of hands. What I've been able to glean, people would come to them and she would lay on her hands, she'd pray over them, and she, again, to great effect, was apparently able to heal people. To what degree I'm not sure. I'm not sure it was, people would come with a broken leg and poof, it's sorted. But, I know there's a very strong family history of that. And to all intents and purposes, that passed on to my mother. She has had moments in her life of, I guess, precognition, without going into too much, because it's not the nicest topic, but she's had precognition of the deaths of people. One instance specifically was to do with quite a young child, and she was able to know that before it happened. And that's the point, really. I mean, I was very young, but she told me that that's the point which she kind of made a decision not to pursue that, because she didn't like having access to that kind of information. It was too upsetting. So yeah, there's that family history, the old Celtic blood, maybe, who knows.
I could see where having a vision of something like that and it actually happening would just be extremely traumatizing.
Mm-hmm. Especially when she mentions that it was almost like a voice in her head that wasn't her own, that sort of informed her, and that's where it was. If that's where it felt intrusive, and like something that she hadn't been seeking. So that's sort of why she shut it. Yeah, so that's the family history. I guess to sort of move on to the stuff that's the earlier stuff. So I lived in a house when I was, for most of my young life. We had several things that kind of happened there. It had been owned by my grandfather before he passed away, and we moved there when I was maybe 8, and I lived there right up to the age of 18. Again, we had several things happening, and it always seemed to be centered around my mum's bedroom. Again, maybe there's a connection that I'm just making on the fly. But for example, we had instances where there were footsteps in that room knocking next to my mum's head whilst she was asleep, sort of weird rhythmic taps, sort of as if trying to wake my mum up. We had an instance where I was, when I'd gone to university, actually, this was after the age of 18, and I'd come back, and I was very unwell at the time. And because I was so unwell, I was sort of crashing in my mum's room so that someone could keep an eye on me. I wasn't having a fever or anything. I wasn't delirious, but it was to do with my nervous system. Long story, very boring. Just to say that I sort of had my marbles, as it were. And I was crashing in my mum's room, and we'd had a few things happening up to that point that my little brother had been aware of. Things sort of being thrown in the room, pens being knocked off of, sideboards and things like that. Everything that you could kind of sort of just chalk up to random things. You find excuses for these things. I was asleep one night. I was just beginning to fall off to sleep, and I started hearing a scratching sound. And we had a cat at the time, but she did her own thing. She was always off out, it's just quite, she was a garden cat, very much so, let's say. So anyway, I heard this scratching at the foot of the bed, which was very unusual, and it sort of brought me to. And I lay there listening, and I thought, is it the cat? God, that's very strange. Why is the cat scratching on the wardrobe? And as I started to sort of pay more attention, the scratching stopped, and under my feet, on the mattress, I felt the mattress begin to depress, as if someone were sitting on the mattress right where my feet were. But it was, if you imagine someone hesitating or trying not to wake you up, if someone were to sort of sit on the bed and try not to wake you, it was very much that kind of a rhythm that at that speed. And needless to say, it was brown pant time, and I gave it a minute again, trying to rationalize what was going on. But at the point at which I was like, no, my feet are definitely hanging down now. I woke my mum up, and it stopped. The thing popped back up, and that was kind of the end of it. But it culminated in me being in the room a couple of nights later, and it was the evening, and I was putting some bits and pieces away in a drawer. I was just sort of like, humming to myself, whatever. The sideboard next to where I was sleeping, it was as though someone had gotten hold of it, and it had some, I think, like crockery or something on it at the time. And it was as if someone had gotten hold of it and just slammed it against the wall. The whole thing shook, all the crockery rattled. I dropped what I was doing, had a moment where I was again, you question yourself, and this sort of seems to be a recurring thing. I find it, even when these things happen, I find it very hard to buy in immediately to something, oh my God, it's a ghost or it's a whatever. So I went over and I checked the sideboard. Nothing there. It wasn't propped up on anything. It's just it's a sideboard on a flat floor, and it was what it was. And again, brown pant time, and I ran out. And at that point, I'm no longer Catholic, but I was raised Catholic, and I told my mum about what had happened, and with everything that had been going on, we put a crucifix in the room, just to be dot the I's and cross the T's. And we put a crucifix in the room, and it all stopped. All of the stuff that had sort of been going on, the footsteps, the knocking, the scratching, whatever, it all stopped. And nothing else happened for a very long time. And I suppose that brings me up to, odds, bits and pieces that have happened randomly, which I can get into. But I suppose the most meaty stuff is what's been going on recently at my partner's house. And there seems to be some fixation centered around me with an entity that is in the flat. In fact, I was there last night and we haven't had anything for a while. It started up again. But for context, I'm not the sort of person that will go to any old building. Buildings in the UK that are old are a dime a dozen. I don't walk into every old building and think, oh my God, is it, I think this place is haunted. I sort of, I believe, as it were. But until something really happens, I sort of just assume that obviously there's nothing there. Anyway, the first time I ever went to this flat, I just knew immediately that something was wrong. The only way I can describe it is when I do have a sense that something is present, I get this the air feels fizzy, which I think I mentioned to you in my voice note, which I know sounds ridiculous, but it's the only way that I can get close to describing what it feels like. The air feels thick and fizzy, and it very much felt like this the first time that I went there. The context, this building it's in London. It's a very tall, it's 5-story, big old Georgian sort of townhouse. For those listeners who don't know what that means sort of architecturally, it's just a very tall, traditional London house. And the flat that he lives in is on the 5th floor, so it's the very top. And it's a split level flat. Very thick walls, very solid stone walls. So I go to his flat this first time and I got the fizzy feeling. I sort of clocked it and I thought, okay, I feel like there's something here, but until something happens, maybe it's just going to go about its business and it's no issue. The first few nights that I stayed there, I would hear, in the night, I would wake up and hear footsteps around the bed. When I say footsteps, not to the point of someone just marching around, sort of willy-nilly around the bed, up and down. But it's more, again, if you imagine someone trying to walk in a room but not wake somebody up, it's that kind of those creaking footsteps. You can hear the floorboards sort of being displaced as somebody's walking. And that would go round the bed, up and down one side particularly, but it would go round from my partner's side round to my side. I felt very, very uncomfortable. And I've been in places where I've felt stuff before and it's been okay. I can feel that there's something there, but I'm not particularly concerned. But I just really felt like it was not pleasant. As I say, this happened a few times, and I eventually I wanted to corroborate with my partner whether he was experiencing something, but I didn't want to lead him into saying, the power of suggestion. Yes, of course. And I've heard a creak and this, that, and the other. And suddenly, we've both gone down the rabbit hole and neither of us needed to. So I just said, have you, do you ever feel like, do you ever get any weird sensations in the flat? He went, oh, you mean the footsteps? So at that point, I was like, okay, right. Well, we can take the the training wheels off here. I said, okay, yeah, the footsteps. Can we please talk about it? And he said, yeah, I hear them all the time. In fact, I woke up the other night. I heard somebody talking in the bedroom when you weren't here. I heard a man's voice. I said, okay, well, what did you do? And he said, well, of course, at first I was sort of questioning myself, and then I was listening, and I sort of lay there and expected it to stop, and it didn't. And I said, well, what was it saying? He said it wasn't loud enough to really make out, the nuance of what was saying, but it was as though someone was talking quietly, in the corner of the room. He woke up because he needed the loo. So, eventually he got out of bed because the talking wasn't stopping, and he went to the loo and he came back and the talking was still going, and he got into bed. Eventually he was just like, well, I guess I better go back to sleep then. As a side note, my partner is also very sensitive, and he spent a lot of time in Savannah in Georgia throughout the pandemic. He was working on a project out there. He had countless things happen to him in Savannah. I mean, I'm not sure about how much we go into that, but so needless to say, he's very sensitive. But he didn't feel threatened by whatever it was that was there. So I was like, okay, well, we're both acknowledging that something's going on here. I feel a bit reassured that it's not just me, whatever. Anyway, the footsteps carried on for some time, and we'd be downstairs, and you could hear footsteps above us in the bedroom, backwards and forwards. And that's when it was loud. Whenever we were downstairs, it was loud. And you could hear, and again, there's no one above us, there's no one next to us. It was sort of the rhythm of a petulant teenager, is the only thing I can think to describe it. That kind of stomping, like you're a bit, excuse my French, a bit pissed off.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, God, I've got to do this or whatever. It was that kind of a sensation. And we'd sort of look at each other and be like, oh God, right, okay. Anyway, it got to the point where this was sort of ramping up and happening more and more frequently. I'd gone up to the loo one evening just as we were getting ready for bed and doing my business, and I suddenly thought, I just got this sensation. I thought, something's about to happen. Something's going to happen. And as I had that feeling, there was this bang outside the door against the wall. My partner was downstairs at the time. It sounded like something had been thrown, but nothing had been thrown. It was just a bang. And I called my partner up, and he came up, and I sort of explained. He's like, don't worry, let's go to bed. So we went to bed, and I was lying there, and I had the most visceral dream of an entity, a grey and orange entity, which I know sounds weird, but I'm telling it how it was. A grey and orange entity holding me and dragging me around this room, and I was screaming and trying to get myself away from it. And every time I was trying to get away, it would get hold of me and it would pull me back, and it was trying to throw me around. And all of a sudden I woke up. I've never had sleep paralysis in my life, never suffered with it, don't have a family history of it, have not suffered with it since these incidents. I felt the presence of something over me in my face and was absolutely terrified. Felt as though I've done a little bit of research on sleep paralysis since this, because, again, wanting to sort of second guess myself constantly. And I was able to move to a degree. I wasn't completely paralyzed. My first thought when I woke up was, I have to wake my partner, because this thing is here, and it wants to hurt me, wants to hurt us, and it's going to go after him. I have to protect him, so I have to wake him up. I was able to move to the point where I was able to rock from side to side. And I felt as though it was less like I was paralyzed and more like felt like I was being restrained. I don't know how to describe it better than that. But I was rocking from side to side, and eventually and I was trying to scream at the same time. And I was murmuring. I was making noise. I was able eventually to rock over to my partner, and me rocking into him woke him up. And at that point, I sort of was able to move again, and it sort of felt like everything dissipated. And I explained what happened, and he was very reassuring, it's okay, go back to bed, blah, 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 blah. First, the time it happened, just chalked it up to maybe I'm working myself up, maybe I've put myself into a situation where I'm sort of, I don't know, creating this situation myself. Maybe it's not real. A few more times I stayed with him. We had the footsteps, but nothing sort of too bad had happened. Then this was about a week later, I was staying there again. I was lying in bed. I'd felt much better because we hadn't had anything really bad. It was just the usual. And I woke up in the middle of the night to the feeling of a hand go round my ankle and yank me down the bed to the point where I physically moved down. It wasn't just the sensation of someone tugging me. I moved towards the end of the bed, at which point, same thing. I felt like I was being constrained, like something was in the room. But same thing again, I was able to make noise and I was able to try and rock to wake my partner up. Eventually, again, was able to rock backwards and forwards and wake him up. And the whole thing dissipated. And at this point, I'm getting quite pretty pissed off with it because, you know, my sleep's being ruined. We're not able to sort of have a functioning relationship because we're both sort of on edge the whole time. We were at that point awake and he went out to the loo. You know, we're both wide awake, sort of do our business. He comes back, we get into bed. And whilst he was out of the room, I could hear the creaking again around the room. So I lost it, and I, you know, was basically shouting at whatever this thing is to, you know, that it wasn't welcome, that I didn't consent to being interfered with or touched, and that it had to leave. Something to that effect. There might have been a few more expletives, which I don't recommend. It's one of those things, you know, you see, I don't know what it is, Ghost Adventures or whatever, and you see them, you know, effing and blinding, and you think, well, that's not the thing to do. But then you're in the moment and you're pissed off and you've been pulled out of bed and you're like, you effing mother. So it's easier said than done. Anyway, so I sort of said all of that and thought, right, that's really going to do the trick. And my partner gets back into bed. We both start falling asleep. And, you know, like clockwork, I hear the footsteps round the bed again. And I just was so exhausted by that point that I didn't know what else to say or do, and I just drifted off, and that was that. And it all seemed to subside for a long time. My partner and I were away in Rome. He's been working out there, so we were sort of living in Rome for the last 4 months. When we got back, and nothing happened. And I was like, "Oh, this is great. This is really good." Until yesterday. Was it yesterday or Friday? I think it was Friday night. We get back to his flat. We'd been out, walked up the stairs, you know, to put my stuff in his room. And I just got that feeling of something's about to happen. And I don't normally get the shivers. This sort of sensation that I get never involves sort of goosebumps or chills or anything like that. It's more sort of an internal feeling is the only way I can describe it. But I got this feeling of something's about to happen, and every hair on my body just was on end. And I thought, oh, Christ, here we go. P.S. I have a mouth like a sailor and I'm trying really hard not to swear.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Taking the Lord's name in vain and all that malarkey. But
I'm right there with you. Don't even worry about that.
So I had this feeling, and I immediately called my partner up, and he came up and it was fine. I said, I feel like this is going to kick off today. So he was like, don't worry, come on, let's go back downstairs. We go downstairs. We're getting ready to go for dinner. And then something which has never really happened before, which is that we started hearing the footsteps downstairs by the front door, inside the door, in the corner of the room. And I just was like, oh, God, right. Okay, so it's downstairs now. What does that mean? Is that, you know, X, Y, and Z? She said, you know what, let's just go for dinner. So we went out, had dinner, come back, you know, feeling good, whatever, going to watch a movie before bed. So we're coming up the stairs. It's a lot of stairs. There's no lift. There's no elevator to get up. So it's a long flight of stairs to get up. So we get to the top and I'm absolutely exhausted. My partner's just behind me and I sort of leant against the wall by the front door. And there was a thud on the door from inside the flat.
Oh.
And there was no flat.
That's so much nope. Okay, continue. I'm sorry. I had to say it because damn.
I mean, yeah. Yes, Shannon, that was my thought. And I just said to my partner, stupidly, I don't know why, I said, did you just knock something? Knowing full well it's just come from in front of my face on the inside of the door. But you do, of course, you ask that question. He's got his keys in his hands and he's like, you know, no, I've got my keys in my hand. Like, no, I didn't thump anything. And I said, well, you know, we call them our friends, which I know sounds weird and maybe that's inviting it in, but we don't know how else to kind of make it nice and talk about it without it being just this really awful thing. I said, well, we've got a friend banging on the inside of the door, at which point we just went upstairs and got the sage and just saged the whole flat to within an inch of its life. And then it was fine. We didn't have another thing happen. It's been absolutely fine the last couple of days. And it's all stopped. But the interesting thing to note, because we were doing some thinking about it, is it seems to be more active when my partner and I have had relationship problems or difficulty, or there seems to be some negativity between us, and that's when it seems to ramp up. Not that we have enormous, in-depth, marital problems or whatever, but when there have been problems, there have been times, that's when it really seems to happen and to gear up. And so I don't know whether that's because it's protective of my partner. I don't know if it's because, I don't know. I was, spitballing with him, today, funnily enough, and I thought maybe it's because it's just that there's a negative atmosphere, and it's sort of like the atmosphere is supercharged, and it's sort of picking up off of that. Because again, I come back to this thing of I don't feel like it's a nice entity. I've been in places before where things have felt fine, and I've known stuff's been there and I've not felt threatened, but it's always felt very, I don't want to use the word like malevolent, because I feel like those kind of terms are really overused, but it just felt very untoward, if that's a better word to use, and if that makes any sense. Just not the nicest energy. So that's kind of what's been going on there. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have any questions about those things specifically before I move on to some bits, but...
Oh man, I was not. I got chills with the knock on the other side of the door thing, and you being pulled down in the bed, and there's a lot of nope in there. And high five for the brown pants reference, because that is truly the right time to use that. So, because you mentioned at the onset that you feel like you're the object of focus, but you also just kind of mentioned that you feel like it also can be a little bit of a flurry around your partner as well. So do you think it's maybe just both of you? Because you did admit that you're both sensitive.
I guess yes and no. Stuff happens when he's there. Again, the footsteps and all that sort of stuff, but he's never been touched. Nothing negative has ever happened to him in terms of being touched But actually, one thing I did forget to mention, and maybe I'm contradicting myself, there's one instance where something unpleasant happened that was more physical with my partner, which is he tried to close his bedroom door randomly one evening. He was at home. He was pushing it, and it was as though something was holding the door open from the other side. And he was pushing it and, checked the floor, and there was nothing in the way. There's no towels or anything. So he sort of opened the door to check, and there's nothing there, and he tried to close it again, and it was like something again was holding it from the other side, at which point he was like, okay, fine, whatever, let's leave the door open, and that was the end of that. But yeah, he's never been touched or pulled out of bed or held down.
Well, lucky him. That's good. Okay, so, I mean, you said it subsided for a long time, and then, I mean, very recently, Friday night, you have this very scary thing go down. So, and maybe this is because you guys you said, you had been traveling, there's a lot of stress in that, you probably were tired, or maybe it's the anticipation that, you would come back and you're like, oh, I hope maybe it's better. Or were you guys, in fact, and this is, you don't need to expound upon this at all, of course, but, were you guys in some kind of a little spat or something like that there was a little tension that evening or the day before, something like that?
Yeah, 100%. We'd had a spat the night before that. We hadn't been together, but he'd been there and I'd been on my phone and whatever. So yeah, we had a spat. It had been sorted by the time we saw each other, and it was, we were fine, laughing, whatever, going out for dinner. But there had been, an altercation. That sounds so heavy, but, an altercation.
Right.
Because when we had gotten back from traveling, I was expecting, I don't know what I was expecting, but I was thinking, God, well, if it's going to kick off, now it's going to be the time. When we got back, and I was like, oh God, the flat feels absolutely fine. God, this is so weird. Maybe it's all over. And then we have this spat, and that's when it happens, which is what led me to thinking, well, maybe it's something around our relationship. I don't know.
Can you imagine though, that's just after a little spat. Can you imagine if you guys were actually in we all know of very abusive and horrible relationships that are extremely, very volatile. Can you imagine what the flat would be if you guys had that kind of a relationship?
I know. Well, it makes me think about so many episodes that I've listened to, not just of your own, but of other podcasts where people have spoken about, their marriages end and their relationships end because these things sort of become so self-perpetuating that, yeah, I mean, I dread to think. I would hate for that to be the case, but he's moving out soon, so that's a boon.
Okay, that was going to be my next question. Have you thought about moving, or has he thought about moving, and do you think that would help? But that, of course, is, I guess, the next question. Then, do you think that is going to help, or do you think that somehow it just gets kicked up there and this thing or things is attached to one or both of you?
I would like to think that it will end, but who knows? I suppose we won't know until we leave. I did make the point to him the other day. We were joking, actually, whilst all of this was going on Friday, joking, oh, maybe, it's like, maybe it's our relationship, whatever, X, Y, and Z. And he said, oh, he said, yeah, he joked, he said, yeah, they're on my side, they're my friends. And I went, babe, you really can't be saying things like that, because the mere fact of you making that joke in their presence,
yeah.
if I've learned anything, you're inviting that.
Right.
Or just leaving, you're just opening that door. And then, of course, he very quickly backtracked. But, I think with these sorts of things, it's sort of how long's a piece of string. I mean, maybe they can come with you. I think maybe it depends on the individual. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, I suppose he should be a little careful with that. I mean, after you pulling your, F you effing F, it did calm down for a little while, right? I mean, not immediately. There were still footsteps, which you went to sleep, which we hear a lot of the time because you're like, well, God, I got to get sleep. So what else am I going to do? Got to go just lay my head down and screw you, I guess. But it worked for a little while. But yeah, him saying, well, there are buddies and friends and high-fiving. I don't know. Is that enough of an invitation? Who knows?
Who knows? Yeah. I mean, I did have a thought the other day, sort of, again, when connecting the dots. And it kind of leads me to sort of one of my other stories about something that happened years ago with my ex-husband, actually. I think I mentioned in my voice note the ghost at the bus stop.
Mm-hmm.
And it sort of made me think, mate, has this, and obviously then connecting with what's going on in my previous home, is this thing actually attached to me? Is this something that sort of comes and goes as part of my life, or is it? I don't know. Maybe it's a me thing, but I don't know. Is this a good time to talk about the bus stop?
Yeah, I think that's a great segue. Absolutely.
It sounds so unglamorous, the bus stop ghost, but it is what it is. So this was have been 2016. New Year's Eve 2016, going into 2017, and I was with my ex-husband at the time. It must have been about 1:00 in the morning. We'd been at a friend's house, seeing the new year, and nothing crazy. I mean, lots of kids there, and one glass of champagne, and everybody goes home. It was that kind of a vibe. So we've walked around the corner, and we're at this bus stop. For context, I'm facing the road, and my partner is facing me. My ex-husband's facing me. Behind me is a wall running left to right, with gates in it that lead up steps to people's houses. So there are gates in the wall. It's quiet evening. It's not a really quiet road, but it's not a main road. It's just a sort of a suburban London street. We're just chatting, and in my peripheral vision to my left, I can see someone walking sort of parallel to the wall, sort of going to walk, as it were, behind us, and then off, and then round the corner or whatever. And behind him is another person. So they're walking along. It's 1:00 in the morning, London, New Year's Eve, thinking, just being aware, of who's around you and going behind you. People can be pissed. You just don't know what's going to happen. So this first guy sort of walks behind me, and I'm talking to my partner. I remember the first guy was in a grey suit. He had dark hair and, must have been in his 30s. Walked behind me and then came out sort of like the other side of me and carried on going. And then the second person behind him, the reason I described the first person is that in my memory, the second person is sort of completely devoid of any description that I can give other than it was a person or what I thought was a person. I just remember them as a grey figure. That's not to say I think it's a shadow person or anything like that. It's just I can't ascribe a look to them. Anyway, they came up behind me to my left, and I'm talking to my partner. And all of a sudden, I noticed that this person's not gone past me, following on from the other person. And I feel this person come right up behind me to the point where I thought they were basically breathing down my neck. And as this happened, I noticed that my partner kind of sort of frowned and sort of leant to one side to look behind me. And I thought, oh God, here we go. Got some bloody idiot, coming up behind me on New Year's Eve. Right. So I turned round to sort of say, we've got a problem here, mate. Is everything all right? And I turned round and, that tired old story, there's nobody behind me. And I flipped back round to my partner. And again, even though I'm sort of totally freaked out, and by the way, the whole of the rest of the street was empty. We were the only people other than these two people walking along. There was no one else. So I flipped back round to my partner, and in my sort of like panic, I said to my partner, I said, did you just see that? He went, yeah. And I said, okay, what did you see? Thinking again, I don't want to lead you into saying something. And he said, that person come up behind you and crouch down. And I said, but there's nobody there. And he went, yeah, I know. I thought it was one of your friends had crouched down to then jump up and throw their arms around you and been like, hey, Happy New Year, whatever, X, Y, and Z. But there was nothing. There was nothing there. And I mean, what do you do after that? I mean, just like, okay, well, that's really freaky. Is like, what could that have been? I feel like let's call it what it probably is, a ghost spirit. Who knows? Is it going to follow us home? So that was that. That was another, again, sort of corroborated experience, sort of some entity showing an interest. Again, it didn't feel particularly nice. It felt like someone wanted to pick a fight with me. Yeah.
And your ex, is he a sensitive person like you are?
He had experiences. He's American, from California and Hawaii, and he'd had experiences as a child where he'd seen things and his family had seen things, but he wasn't sensitive in the way that I would describe myself as sensitive, no. But he's seen stuff. Yeah.
I mean, at least in that case, well, so far, all of the cases up till now, your stories include somebody else experiencing these things with you, which is always a relief. And it's also interesting that even though he was facing this, whatever it was, he also really couldn't describe it any better than it was a person shaped. You both thought it was a person of some sort, but it obviously wasn't.
And I've asked him since, because, I'm clearly I'm on your podcast. This sort of thing fascinates me. And I had said to him, what did you see? What did it look like? And he just is like, I can't really tell you. I partly wasn't paying attention, and partly I don't know. I can't really describe it. Just someone approached you, which makes me think, well, was it in both of our mind's eye? Was it actually really there? Was it something we were just both very aware of in a very primal sense? I don't know. There was no one else there to ask. You couldn't ask Doris at the bus stop, oh, did you see that bloke disappear behind me? It's like, it's just us two on an empty street. So yeah, that was that.
I mean, and at that point in your life, are you kind of, you mentioned it a little bit, like, oh, well, I mean, I hope this stays here. Like, don't come home with us. At that point, were you kind of going, I wonder if I should sage when I get home, or say something like, this is my place? Did you do anything like that?
Well, at that point in my life, I wasn't as far down the rabbit hole as I think I am now. I was more sort of standing on the edge, looking in, thinking, oh, that looks interesting down there. So the whole idea of saging and affirmations or incantation, anything like that, just was so far outside of my scope that I just went home and hoped for the best, really. And luckily, sort of nothing happened. But yeah, it was fine. I do have another corroboration story, actually, unless you wanted to ask any more questions.
No, go right ahead, Ed. Thanks.
Again, this is another spirit story. I actually, to my mind, experienced transmutation of an object that my friend witnessed. She was actually, I guess, involved. I was staying with some friends. I was doing a job. I'm a creative and I move around a lot for work sometimes. as part of this project that I was doing, I was staying at a friend's house, one of the other people who I was working with. And I'd known that this she and I had spoken very openly about the spirit world and et cetera, et cetera. As I say, I was sort of like doing my Alice in Wonderland routine down the rabbit hole at this point. So we were talking a lot about it, and she'd sort of opened up that her family home there was a spirit there, and it was of a girl who had died there about 10, 15 years before her parents moved in, she was a woman actually, but she was a young woman. She had learning difficulties, and she sort of had the cognitive age of a 9 or a 10-year-old. And this spirit, or they believed that it was of this girl, was known to move things around the house. And, I was thinking, oh, interesting story. Yeah, of course. Yeah, lovely. Well, right. Well, we'll see what happens when I get there, kind of a thing. I was staying in the house. I'd arrived, and I'd been staying in this one room the first couple of nights. Nothing happening. And this was the older part of the house. There was an old part and a new part. And me being sort of naive and I guess running on default, I'd thought, well, this, if anything's going to happen, it's in the old part of the house. So I was expecting something to happen. Nothing did. I didn't feel weird. I didn't get this, fizzy sensation, whatever. So I was kind of like, oh, whatever. Nothing's going to happen then. First couple of nights passed, and then I had to be moved into a different room for various reasons, which was in the newer part of the house. And the moment that I was in that room, I just was like, oh, okay, right, this is where it is. And particularly one corner of the room where I felt like I was being watched, essentially. And I always hate that description because it just doesn't do justice to the feeling. You hear so many people talking about that sensation of, I felt like I was being watched, which is such a ephemeral thing to say. But when you're experiencing it, it's such a primal thing that I think we all experience, that when you're being watched and there's something there and you can't see it, but it's happening, it's real. So that's just a side tangent. But I had that feeling, and that lasted for about 2 days. I did not want to be in that room. I didn't want to sleep in there. I didn't want to use the bathroom in there, nothing. Not because it felt threatening, but it just was so keenly like I was being watched. It was very uncomfortable. Day 3 comes round of staying in that room. All the joys of spring. Everything's fine. I was like, what the hell was I worried about? God, this feels fine. It's like, oh, you've been working yourself up, sort of berate myself for that. Couple of nights sleeping in there, completely forgotten about everything that's going on, and or had gone on, and that feeling. Another one of my colleagues came, who's a very good friend as well, and she crashed in that room with me too. Enormous double bed. So we're crashed in there, and I had to get up early on the final morning. My friend didn't, so she woke up when I woke up, and she's sort of there on her phone typing away. And I was like, all right, well, I'm just going to use the shower or whatever in the ensuite. So I popped my phone on the floor next to the bed, and as I always do, and I went to the ensuite, which is next to the bed, did a shower, got ready, etc., etc., and I came out and picked up my bag, and I went to pick my phone up off the floor, and my phone wasn't there. And I thought, God, that's weird. Oh, I must have packed it in my bag, emptied my bag, not there. And my friend said to me, what's up? I explained. She's like, oh, okay, well, did you put it in your bag? All those questions you ask. It's turned my side of the bed upside down. And bearing in mind, my friend didn't know about this supposed ghost and the moving of things. So I was like, right, well, if you find it, please, can you bring it to where we're working? And she's like, yeah, no problem. So I'm walking towards the door, and she just said to me, is this it? And I turned around, and she had my phone in her hand, and she'd been lying on her side, facing away from where I was lying the whole time, just on her phone. And I was like, well, yeah, of course, that's my phone. Where was it? And she's like, I don't know. It was in my lap. And the hackles went up on the back of my neck. And I just knew in that moment that was whoever this person was who likes to move things around the house. That was them saying to me, yep, I was here the whole time. And it did happen. it felt very playful. It felt very like a little kind of prod at the end before I left. Yeah, and how my phone moved from the floor into my friend's lap, I can't think. I mean, the only explanation I can have is that she's reached over while I was in the shower, picked up the phone and put it in her lap. Could she have done that? Well, of course. And a lot of people would say that, yeah, well, that's the only explanation. But this is someone that one of my best friends who I've known for, well, now 15 years, at the time, 10. She's not that kind of a person. So unless she's had some funny turn, at 8 o'clock on a Friday morning and decided to just do something to try and freak me out, is that a possibility? Yes. Do I think it's more likely that it's tied to this feeling that I was having and the story that I'd had from the people who've lived there about things being moved and turning up where they shouldn't be? For my money, that's where I'm going to go.
Yeah, and as you said, it didn't seem to be her MO to do something like that. And even if it was, she didn't know about the ghost and the ghost moving things. So what a strange thing to choose to do, especially since she didn't know about that information.
Yeah. Yeah.
How did she not feel that either? That is such a strange, interesting story.
That's what I mean. I mean, this has weight. It's not like, a flower turned up in my lap and it's, it weighs next to nothing. And it's like, well, whatever. I mean, how's a flower going to end up in her lap? But you get my point. It's like, that's an iPhone. That thing's got some weight on it.
Yeah, I like that story. It's just those strange one-offs. But then again, you're kind of going, well, you're at the center of all of this. So is it one-offs or just all these different places that you go, which I know there's others coming, you get these feelings and things do end up going down. So, in fact, if we could, let's talk next then about, it was the old coaching inn where it got turned into the home for adults with the learning difficulties. Can we talk about that place a little bit?
So I used to work, and my mum actually worked for a lot longer than me. She was there for 20 odd years at this home for adults with learning difficulties. And it used to be, I mean, it's got to have been upwards of 500 years old. And it was an old coaching inn. So, coaching inn 101, for anyone who doesn't know what that is. Basically, there's two cities quite relatively close to each other. You've got London and Cambridge. And before the advent of motorways, back in the day, they used to have obviously a main road where, horse and cart would go down and et cetera, wagons. And people would stop in various coaching inns along these main roads to, replenish, stay the night, feed the horses, et cetera. So that's what this place was. It was huge. I mean, we're talking, upwards of 30 rooms. I mean, huge, massive, sprawling grounds. And there were some new builds on the land as well. But most of the activity was centered around this big old house. There are various specific stories, but I guess the headline with it is that nothing bad ever happened there, but you could not go to that house without something happening, to the point where even the manager of the property acknowledged that things were going on. You used to have to do something called sleep-ins, because obviously someone's always got to be present on site, in case of an emergency. So, overnight, one person will sleep there in one of the rooms, and people would refuse to sleep there because so much stuff would happen. And the manager would, acknowledge, I know that, we all know that this is happening, but you've just got to suck it up because we've got to be here. But the sort of things that will happen, I mean, there's one in particular, which I guess is probably, they're all interesting, but there was a man who was known to appear on the lower levels of the house, mostly the lower levels, and in the garden, dressed in English Civil War era garb. For anyone who doesn't know, I think that's sort of like the early 1600s. And this man specifically had a big sort of floppy felt hat with a feather in it. I think a feather in it. I'm pretty sure a feather in it, and a cloak. I never saw this person, but I did sense them. I'll come to that in a second. But we had instances where he was seen, people would come into the house and he would be seen. There was this big old staircase that kind of, big grand staircase that went up and sort of would partition left and right and then go back up on itself, if that makes sense, in the main sort of like bit of the house. I don't know what they call that, sort of a staircase. But anyway, so he was often seen at the bottom of those stairs wandering around, occasionally would be seen to go up. And there was a lot of question at the time, that I knew people who were working there. People would say, well, is this just sort of like, I guess, a residual haunting? Is it interactive, whatever? And we had that question answered when a friend of ours was working and saw this gentleman at the bottom of the stairs, and she was not afraid to, she didn't scare easily. So her concern was more, we have vulnerable adults here. If this is a person that's actually in here, I want to know who they are and what's going on. So she confronted them. She called out and she said, "Excuse me, what are you doing in here?" And this person ignored her and just proceeded to walk up the steps. At which point she duly followed him up the steps, demanding that he explain to her what he was doing there. She got up to the first level. He stopped and he turned around and he looked at her. She thinks that he's about to answer. He turns back around, walks down the hallway into one of the bedrooms. And these bedrooms used to be a lot bigger. They were partitioned up for various reasons later in the place's history. And this guy just walked straight through this artificial partition, at which point she had her brown pants moment, as you would, and ran back down the stairs. And, that's when we all kind of connected the dots and were like, well, no, this thing's aware of what's going on around it, or at least is interactive. Yeah. And he, as I said, I never saw him, but I did have an instance where, again, some more corroboration for you. I'd only just started working there at this house, and I was being shown around, and I went into this one particular room. Obviously the whole house is old, but it had been done up a little bit. It was kind of sort of like 90s decor. It had some old couches in there and stuff. And I was drawn to this one particular armchair, and I just got the funny feeling about it. And I think I would say this is the first time I ever had that sensation where I kind of knew that there was something uncomfortable going on. And I clocked it and I thought, God, I really do not like this armchair. It's giving me the willies. Didn't think anything more of it, carried on with my tour. Years later, and we're talking 6-7 years, I was working for the same organization, but in a different house, modern house in another town near us. And I was talking to a friend, and we got talking about this guy that was seen. And I said, because he's seen at the bottom of the stairs. And she said, oh, yeah, but he's also sometimes seen in the I think it's called the breakout room. It's got sofas and stuff. And she said, oh, he's seen in the breakout room. People go in and they see him sitting in the armchair in the corner. And it's like the light went on, and I was like, that's why. And again, for me, it's like you hear these stories sort of secondhand. Oh, I saw this person, I saw that person. But when you're able to have these instances of sort of, that's not prompted, I've not asked you, you sort of start to trust yourself a little more in your judgment when these things happen. But we had all sorts of things there. You would often hear children laughing, which I know sounds it's like one of your big no's, but you had children laughing. People would often comment. We'd have workmen come in and sort of work on the property, and they'd often comment, "Oh, it's so nice to hear, kids having such a good time," and what have you. And that's when you'd have to sort of explain to them, like, "I'm really sorry, there are no children here." You can imagine the response that got.
Mm-hmm.
You'd often hear women's voices. My mum had an incident where she had to go down to the basement, and she opened the door to the basement, and she heard two women talking down there. And she stood there. They were sort of talking quite sort of quietly. Again, couldn't quite make out what they were saying, but it was very distinctly a conversation. But again, you've got to get on with the job when you're somewhere. You can't sort of just have a meltdown and sort of like flee the premises. You kind of just got to like suck it up and go into the basement. And it stopped when my mum went down there. But the women talking was often heard in that building. They did have one instance there which we never got to the bottom of, because the guy simply refused to talk about it. But we had a workman there, and he'd come in, and again he was in the basement when my mum had heard these voices and was doing some work down there, and he'd been absolutely fine. It was a nice day. We just heard him scream at the top of his lungs, ran up the stairs, got in his van, and flew off of the premises. Refused to come back, refused to collect his tools, refused to even discuss what had happened. And we never came back. We had to arrange for the tools to be sent to him. Like it was a whole thing, which felt very, I mean, what was that? I don't know. Is that more his reaction than the fact that you've got some, sort of just gossipy women in the basement? Sorry if that sounded misogynistic, but, a couple of women chatting down there, it's like, is that his reaction, or is it because he's seen the devil incarnate? I don't know. But
I mean, when a grown man screams, runs off premises, and leaves his tools behind, and then won't even come back for them, he must have had something really bad happen. I don't mean to laugh, but you painted a really good picture, and you're kind of going, what the hell happened, dude?
Yeah, like, are you okay, hon? That seems pretty full on. Yeah.
I don't think he could handle most of the things that you've already told me. That's for sure. Okay, so
it takes the best. It takes the best of us.
Yeah, I'd say so. Some of you guys are like, listen, I just need to get some damn sleep. So that's what I'm going to do. Carry on, tugging at my toes and walking around the bed. So being that this is a 500-year-old house, this is it's funny to say this out loud, but you mentioned that the Civil War clothing wearing man would usually be seen on the lower levels. So does that then mean that most of the upper levels were then added on recently? And of course, recently could be 200 years, ago, considering this is a 500-year-old house. But were then most of the levels added onto, or the parts of the house added onto after, he would have been there to walk around them?
As far as I'm aware, I think the main body of the building had always been there. I might be wrong. The age of the building itself, maybe it could be that the building itself was newer, but there had been stables and a coaching house on that land for that amount of time. But the building was old enough that, I guess this might answer the question, the building was old enough that it had priest holes in it. Do you guys know what priest holes are?
No, what's that?
So basically around about the time of the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, that we had, there was a lot of back and forth with Catholic plots to overthrow the royal family. Elizabeth and Queen Mary, and all the back and forth of, is it going to be, Protestant or Catholic, etc., etc. And Catholicism was outlawed at various times for various reasons. But I think that was around the time of like 1550 to early 1600s. And buildings or families who were sympathetic to Catholics, or who were Catholic themselves and keeping it underground, would build priest holes in their property, which were disguised in the buildings, so that they would house priests and other Catholics or other dissident Catholics, and they would allow those dissident Catholics to hide in these concealed rooms in their properties. So that's what a priest hole is. And so that kind of, I guess, dates the building. And I know that this building has priest holes. So maybe the actual main body of the building is old enough that it would have been at the time of the Civil War. But why he was around the lower levels specifically, I don't know. He's been seen in the grounds as well, the grounds of the building, walking around in the gardens. So who knows? Who knows?
Maybe they just get tired of walking up all those damn stairs too. Yeah, why not? We do, so.
I'm with you on that.
Fascinating history, by the way. When terms like that come up, I'm like, yes, please let me know what that is. I've never even heard of that. That is fascinating. Your mom, being that she worked there for 20 plus years, I'd imagine, and you as well, but there's only probably so much that both of you could do. I would imagine that your mother would just have to really fortify her walls to work at a place like that for that long.
Yeah, my mum's interesting. She's a very my mum is very unassuming, and so she has spoken about obviously the things that she experiences and things that happen, and she's sort of very forthcoming. But I imagine that if she were going through any difficulty or any sort of like anything sort of trying to really interact, that she would not be the first person to sort of like, go off and go on and on about it. But the thing about this particular property is, again, I come back to, nothing felt horrible. Nothing felt like it was unpleasant. And if anything, it was a lot of laughter. A lot of the voices that were heard were children laughing, but women laughing, voices in conversation, people having a good time. And so the only fear that would ever come from it was the fear of not really understanding what it exactly was, and just how, it's inherently a spooky thing. Oh, there's voices in the cellar, but it's not like you've got, women screaming up the stairs for you to get out. It's just two women having a conversation.
Except for that one guy that ran screaming out. Maybe he had a little bit of a different experience down there. But maybe he didn't. Maybe it really was just the voices alone. And he's like, yep, I'm out. It's too much for me.
Yeah, I mean, if only we could get him on the line.
Yeah, no kidding. Talk to somebody, dude. It sounds like you could use it.
Exactly.
Although for me, I mean, as you said already, the whole kids, I mean, if I woke up tonight and I heard children laughing downstairs, I mean, my daughter's 14, and if I hear her at night, it's because she's like playing her Grand Theft Auto too late or something. I mean, I'm not going to hear her giggling at 3 a.m. I'd be like, well, finally it's happened. I've invited something in, and hell no. It would just freak me right out.
Yeah, default reaction to children laughing in the night is not, oh, how cute.
Yeah, precious.
It's I need to call the priest.
Whatever it takes, let's handle business, because yeah, children are precious when they're laughing, but not at 3 a.m. And when you don't have children that would laugh like that. Yeah, no, thank you. Why don't we go to the other super old house that you mentioned? And I think it was a friend of yours, right? The property's actually outside of London.
Yes. So this house is, again, quite old. I think it's in the region, from what my friend said, of about 400 years old. And it's, I don't even really know where to start with it. So much stuff happened there. It's sort of the closest that I've ever heard firsthand or experienced around this kind of idea of portal is the only way I can describe it, for things to come in, because the stories that I've heard firsthand from my friends there are so far-ranging that I don't really know how to kind of ascribe it. I don't know how to segment it, or to say, oh, well, that's ghosts, or it's whatever. So this house, like I say, it's 400 years old, and my friends bought it as a sort of, I guess, a bolt hole from London, as a retreat to just go off. They're quite well off, and they bought it as a second home. So when they first bought it, they sent their sister, my friend's sister, there to just kind of help get the place set up for them. They were, busy off working. They were very successful in their respective fields. The sister had gone down to get the place ready, and the first sort of idea that they had was some semblance of fact that this place was not all that it seemed. Was their sister arrived at the property and walked up into the village, the local village, very small little village, and on the way up she saw, one of the local villagers, sort of introduced herself, said, oh, my sister and my brother-in-law have just bought the X, Y, and Z property. Like, they really want to get to know people. Like, would you like to come over for a cup of tea when they're next down? And this person said, whatever the name of the property was, said, oh, that property. And, my friend's sister was like, yeah. And this person just was like, no way. Of course, that's the first thing where you're like, oh, maybe something's not going on here. Again, before my friends had a chance to move in, the sister's still down there. This is not long after this person sort of respectfully declined the invitation to come over for tea. And she was sitting in the kitchen. So to describe the layout of this house, it's a long rectangle, And in the center of the house, there is a very large staircase that goes up and round and back up and round, and it sort of goes round in a square up. I think the house is 4 stories, including the loft. And she was sitting in the kitchen, which is at the opposite side of the house to the front door. She was sitting reading a magazine, and she had no TV on or anything. She was waiting, I think, for a phone call from my friend who was going to say, going to come down or whatever to see the place. And she was reading her magazine, and she said all of a sudden the hairs went up on her, her hackles went up. She said from the center of the stairwell, from the top of the building, she heard what she can only describe as an almighty roar. Connecting the dots here with your recent guest. She heard this roar come down through the stairwell and sort of reverberate through the house. She froze, as you would do, didn't know what to do, couldn't believe what she'd just experienced. But she said she knew in that moment, she had this overwhelming sense of, if I don't leave right this moment, something really bad is going to happen. And she said she doesn't know where she got the courage, but she picked up the house phone. She didn't even pick up her mobile. She just grabbed the nearest thing, which was the house phone. She had the car keys, I think, in her pocket. And she was able to summon the courage to run through the house, past the stairwell, out of the house, got into the car, and from the car she called her mum and explained what had happened, and drove back to London, didn't lock the house, didn't shut the front door, nothing, just bolted. So they then decided that they were going to get, they'd had, I think at that point, my friend and her husband had been down and sort of like come to see the property, and they'd had a few other sort of like weird things moving and like odd bits and pieces. And I think their mum had seen an old man in one of the rooms sitting in a chair. Again, nothing particularly, out of the ordinary. When you're saying you're seeing an old man in a chair is not out of the ordinary, you know what kind of a level we're operating on. But she'd seen an old man in a chair. So they decided to get a healer in to clear the place out, and this bloke came in and said that had dinner with them, did a cleansing of the house, and afterwards said to them that the man that they'd seen was a previous tenant, someone who'd lived there previously. And this man knew nothing, by the way, this healer knew nothing about the family. Big Irish family. All people always coming in and out, lots of sort of siblings, cousins, kids, like it was a busy house. This guy just said, this guy just keeps saying to me, you're all so loud. You're just so noisy. There's so many of you, you're so loud, which she thought was interesting. But she said the things that you guys are beginning to experience, he said, they are coming in from the stream. And there's a stream that runs parallel to the house through the grounds. And he said, that's where they're all coming in from. And he said, the reason that so much is coming in, and he said, there's a lot more here than what you have experienced, is that when you have a house that is so old and is left empty for such long periods of time, it's almost like an invitation to take up residence. It's like it wants to be filled with things coming in. So that's sort of the setup for what they were to experience over the next few years. I suppose the most bizarre things that had happened there, I mean, other than this roar, which they, to my knowledge, didn't experience again after this cleansing, it quietened down a bit, but then things would begin to happen more and more as they'd spend time away from the property. They were in bed one night, my friend and her husband, and they had 2 small children. The children were quite small at the time. And they were lying in bed. The husband, by the way, huge skeptic, like didn't believe any of it. I mean, he's seen and witnessed several things since, and he's such an ardent skeptic that he still doesn't believe it, even though these things have happened to him. So they were lying in bed, and in small hours of the morning, all of a sudden they hear their daughter screaming bloody murder from her bedroom, which is on the opposite side of the house. She flies into their room, runs into their room, jumps into bed. They're sort of half asleep, trying to calm her down, asking what's wrong. She's just wailing. And all of a sudden, their bedroom door just starts slamming open and closed and open and closed and open and closed. And they just both froze, obviously, as you would, staring at the door. At which point, the husband, he's a big man. He's like broad, 6'4", like he's not small. He just scooped them up, went and got the son, and they just booked it back to London in the car. They got the healer back in, the healer did the cleansing, it all calmed down again. That's when they began to notice that things around the house would start disappearing. Small objects, keys, books, nothing huge, but, things that you need. Or you'd go into the pantry and you'd go to pick up, I don't know, a jar of rice or something, and the jar of rice would be missing. But constantly in its place was left a small pile of what my friend described as like ash or dust. And we were talking about this and we're trying to sort of like, what on earth does that mean? So of course we're on, Google trying to do the thing, find out what that means. We came across, I can't even remember the name of the article now, but we came across this article which was describing how that is a well-known, I don't know how well-known, but it's a known thing where house elves, I don't know how else to say it, when they move things or borrow things, will leave piles of dust or ash in the object's place in order to, I guess, mark that they've taken it, or I don't know, but that's just a phenomenon that is associated. And these objects would show up later in random other places, or sometimes back where they'd put them. But there was always this pile of dust. And I guess, I don't know whether this is the house elf, but do you want me to talk about the brownie?
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
It's a segue to the brownie.
Yeah.
So a mutual friend of ours, this is my friend Dan, he was helping them to settle in. This was quite early in their in their sort of buying the property. He's a very straight-laced guy, really sweet, but he's sort of like, he's a bloke, he's a bloke. He's got a shaved head, he's a bloke. And he was there with a friend, painting the property and doing the skirting and just getting it sort of, into a more livable shape than it had been. And whilst he'd been there with his sort of like colleague, there was only two of them, they'd both experienced little things, being tugged on the shoulder and sort of like, again, I guess, small fry kind of paranormal experiences. And they'd been there about a week, and he was upstairs and his colleague was downstairs, and he was painting one of the walls, and they had the radio on quite low. Over the sound of the radio, I'm gonna do the sound, and I apologize because it is humorous, but he just heard this voice and it went, ha, ha, ha. And he said he froze, and he just knew that there was something there. And he called out to his friend and he said, "Did you just hear that?" And his friend went, "Yeah, was that not you?" And he said, "No, it wasn't." And he looked to his left, and the room that he was in, the door was to his left, and it opened through the corridor where the stairwell was, and then through into another bedroom. And standing in the doorway of the other bedroom was a small brown man, hunched forward. I wish I could show you how he described it to me, but I'll try and explain it. Was sort of half crouched, with his like one foot in front of the other as if it was walking, with its hands out in front of it as if, those kind of old-fashioned cartoons where something's creeping and it's got its hands out in front of it.
Mm-hmm.
So it had its hands out in front of it, and it was sort of in profile, but it had turned its face to him, and it had a long nose, pointed ears, bald, brown, and it had a tail, and it was just staring at him. And they just locked eyes, and he didn't know what to do. What do you do in that situation? And he thought, right, well, do I run? Do I have to go past it if I want to run? Is it going to move? And then after what he described as feeling like a lifetime, this thing walked forward slowly, one foot in front of the other, into the ensuite bathroom of that room. And my friend stood there for a minute and then thought, well, I don't know if I believe what I've just seen. I'm going to go and see if this thing is still in there. So he walked through into the bedroom and looked into the ensuite bathroom, and the window was open, which it had not been. And underneath the window to the ensuite bathroom is the stream. And this thing was nowhere to be seen. He went home, did some research, was trying to find out what on earth it was that he'd seen. And after ages of looking, I think he ended up having to go to the local library. I mean, he was trying everything. He couldn't find a picture. He saw things that kind of approximated it, gnomes and goblins and this, that, and the other, but nothing looked exactly like what he had seen until he came across a book, a Victorian book with etchings in them of various folkloric creatures. And he said this one picture that he found was exactly what he had seen. And it was this creature was named a Brownie. So that's the Brownie story. No one ever, to my knowledge, saw it again. But you start putting it with all the other things, and it's just wild. It got to the point where they had so many stories about this place, and they loved telling them because they were, my friend, she's very spiritual. The husband is not. So she loved talking to, me about it and this, that, and the other. But it got to the point where she would tell, people who weren't perhaps so open, and people stopped visiting because they were so freaked out before they got there. So now it's, oh, the house is fine. We had it cleared and there's nothing there. There's nothing there. But I've got my suspicions that a lot still goes on in that place.
Isn't that amazing, though? Because science wants things that are repeatable in order to prove it. But this property in and of itself hardly seems to repeat anything. The Lion's Roar was only a one-off. The Brownie was a one-off. And what an incredible one-off for the Brownie. I am so on board with tiny little people and goblins and things. And I mean, John Olson has had a ton of people that have come to him with these little Brownie stories. But the second you said tail, I'm like, I don't know if I could deal with that too well. You already have this tiny, tiny little man, and you did describe it very well, seeming to creep around, and he's got a damn tail. Like, I don't know. That no wonder this guy kind of essentially it sounded like he got bit by the bug and really started to research this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have. You think you would think you were going mad otherwise. I mean, it's hard enough that I guess for someone who is open, and if you witness something and you already have sort of a propensity. I think most people have a propensity to question yourself, even though you're seeing it and it's happening to you. You question it. If you were to see something like that, I don't know how I could reconcile what my senses are telling me with what you believe to be true about the universe. And at that point, all bets are off. It's like, you know what? I mean, take me now, Jesus, because that's like next level. I mean, that blows the whole thing wide open. Yeah. So
yeah, because shadows are one thing, ghosts are one thing, but then you have this dude, this bald, pointy-nosed little creeper with a tail, and he seems very interactive, right? So that's a whole nother level of nope right there. I am fascinated by them, but I just can't really imagine really honestly seeing one of those things, whether it be out in the bush or in your home.
I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what's worse. I mean, seeing it in nature, is it, you might think that you can get away from it. If it's in your home, it's like, you said before, so invasive. It's in your space. I mean, it's not even his home. Imagine being told that. Oh, P.S. I saw a weird little goblin in your ensuite bathroom today.
Yeah, by the way, saw the tiny little bald dude with the tail. Awesome. What are we calling him? Like, does he stay for dinner? Yeah, that's... What do you do after that? I don't even know.
I mean, I don't know. I have no answer for that question. I mean, I'm in shock, and I'm talking to you about it 5 years after somebody up and told. I'm like, I don't know.
That house is cool, though, huh? Yeah, I would imagine they still have some things going on there. And what you said, and you even said this in the voicemail, but you mentioned I think it was titled "The Lion Roars" is what I titled that episode. and it was the exact same thing referenced. And then it was Debbie for the Somerset UK, the Elemental episode. And she's actually on Patreon with us as well. One of these days I need to do a live earlier in the morning time so that you guys can join in. Maybe I'll do a UK edition and then I'll have all of you guys on and then everyone else can watch the replay. But the fact that the water in both cases of both of these homes, this one is her own home that she was referencing. Unfortunately, she has to stay there and she still has things going on. But this idea of the water, them not only being attracted to it, but it being a source of energy for them, and them essentially being able to be carried in and out via this energy source. It is a vein that is carried through in a lot of these stories.
Yeah, when I heard that, actually, when I was listening to that episode, and she mentioned that the stream was running under the house, because I think she was questioning about why is it in the newer part of the house, and she said that she found out the stream went under there, and I sort of threw my hands in the air. I was like, yeah, it's it. It all makes sense, you get those little snippets, those little tidbits, and you're like, yeah, I get it. I can connect the dots here.
But do your friends still live in that home?
They do. They lived in it for a while. They moved out of London, kept the London home, and they moved in there full time. And I mean, this is why I say I think stuff still goes on there. They were back pretty sharpish after that. They're like, no, we're going to move back to London. And we're sort of like, why? Oh no, we just just kind of changed our mind. It's like you don't up your entire family and move and then come back. You know, a couple of months later. It's sort of not really a fun thing, but who knows? Yeah,
we're like, we understand. You don't have to say no more, basically, right? You're like, don't worry, you don't have to expand upon that.
Exactly. I don't know how. I guess the only story I have left, and I don't know if we have time, is my friend's grandfather's RAF UFO story. So my friend's grandfather, I was talking to her the other day. She's a big fan of the podcast, so I said, "Can I have permission to tell it?" And she gave it to me. So her grandfather was in the RAF. He's since passed, but he was in the RAF, and he was actually stationed in America for a time. He was sent out there. I don't know exactly where. I think it was a desert region, so I'm guessing southwest somewhere, possibly near you. Who knows? Anyway, he was stationed there, and he had two experiences whilst he was out there. The first one. He and his squadron were just on a routine exercise, doing their thing. And on their radar, a large object, I think equivalent size of a jet plane, was seen on radar, and it flew past them. The entire squadron saw this object. It was a large silver disc. It flew past them all, and as it flew past them, all of their electronic equipment went completely haywire. And being obviously trained observers, they knew that this was not a plane. For one, it was a large metallic disc. Two, it was moving at a speed that their fighter planes could not operate at, or any known plane for that matter. And three, it was scrambling all of their electronic equipment. So that was, I guess, their first foray into sort of like, oh, this is, there's some weird stuff going on out here. But I guess the one that's sort of much, to my mind, more interesting is this is an experience that her granddad didn't talk about for decades until I think not long before he passed. But whilst he was stationed in America, his his squadron were scrambled one day up in their planes, and they were told, we believe that we've had an incursion and a vehicle has landed in the desert, and we want you to go and see if you can find it. They weren't told at this point anything other than, we've had an incursion, something's landed, can you go and have a look? So they all go up in their planes, they go out and off separately because they're obviously covering a wide distance. And he can't see anything, hasn't seen anything. And suddenly back over the radio, they are all told they have to return to base immediately. So they all turn around, make their way back, they land. At which point, the moment that they land, they're all separated and taken to different holding rooms and are met by, or whilst they're in the room, they are met by some men in black suits who came in and interrogated them. When I say them, I mean independently. All the squadron repeated essentially the same story. But these men interrogated her grandfather, asking what he had seen, if he had seen anything, and what he had seen. Extremely threatening, saying that he'd signed the Official Secrets Act and his career was at risk if he didn't tell them what he knew, or if he were to repeat anything that had happened. And of course, him, being quite a, stalwart stand-up person, came out and thought, I'm not going to talk about this, but he did to his squadron. They obviously spoke, after the event, and one of them said that he had found what they were looking for, and he said that he had seen what he believed to be a downed UFO. It was not an aircraft. It was a downed, literal, unidentified flying object. And there were later whispers that, and how true this is, I don't know, because of course this is all, so far after the event X, Y, and Z, but there had been talk amongst them that there had been inhabitants or an inhabitant in this vehicle who had died when by the time that the body was recovered. And I said to my friend, well, can you just tell me a little bit more about, like, did your granddad ever describe these men, like these men in black? Like, what did he say what they were? Were they just literally men in black suits? And she said he never spoke to her about it because she was so young when he passed, but he'd spoken to her grandma. And the way that he described them to her grandma, the two words that he used to describe them were eerie and threatening. Who describes somebody as eerie? I don't know. That's not really a word you throw around very often. But he proceeded to sit on that piece of information for decades and decades and decades.
Yeah, and that is funny because you hear that about the men in black. Someone will say they were just off, or they spoke strangely, or they what was the story? They couldn't use a pen or a pencil properly, right? They just can't quite human, right? So I guess how else do you describe that as eerie? And I mean, listening to this, it's so Roswell-esque, right? There's threats of, hey, you're going to not talk about this. You get the downed UFO and possibly an inhabitant inside. I love encounters like that. And the fact that, I mean, the poor guy, though, can't even talk about this until he's almost passed away. And that it's the same over here, as you well know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And I just really hope that there's an environment being created now where people are more able to talk about this. But my worry is around the UFO topic is that I think it's being framed in such a way that unless it's something that is so completely tangible and something that is so utterly measurable in a scientific way, which is no bad thing to a degree, but I think there will still be this reticence for people to talk about, there's so much social conditioning around downed UFO stories, and I saw this and I saw that, unless it sort of fits with what is in the mainstream of, I saw a tic-tac object and it was, recorded by a Navy pilot. I think there's still going to be a lot of doubt, even though so many people are now vindicated by this acknowledgement of UAPs. It's sort of like, I feel like it's acknowledgement in a very small lane. It's not like, yeah, well, we've seen them in the skies and we've also recovered them and we're also potentially testing, unknown technology, and these military contractors have got hold of it and they're doing X, Y, and Z, and we're, it's not that. It's, we saw a tic-tac object on a camera strapped to a plane. So who knows?
Yeah, and do you mean that as far as it's one thing to see an actual physical disc, but then another if it's, something more like lights or orbs that can interact and split into four, and they're doing crazy maneuvers, or are they coming out of what looks like some kind of a portal or something? Like those are the kind of things that then muddy the waters even more.
Yeah, I think there's still going to be a large element of people turning their noses up. I think, again, it's like I said, it's one thing, if one was to turn around and say, I saw a large spherical silver object fly past the side of my plane while I was en route to, I don't know, LA. and it zipped off. And I think people go, oh yeah, well, I saw something in, the New York Times about that, and I know that the American government's acknowledged they're real. I think it will still be a very different reaction if it was, well, I was scrambled and I saw a downed UFO and I was told there were inhabitants in it that died, or I was standing in a field and this portal opened and these weird lights came out and danced around each other, and I lost 3 hours of time and then disappeared. It's sort of, I feel like, how are we still having a conversation where perhaps there's incredulity? It's like the mere fact that something people have been told they're crazy for thinking for the last 60 years, we're now being told is real. But it's like this, it's only so much of an incremental conversation.
Well, and I love the fact that this man, at the end, he's like, you know what, screw it. I need to tell somebody about this. Someone in my family needs to hear this story. And what's the percentage of people that do that? I mean, 5, 10, maybe even less than the 5%. I don't know. But I mean, how many of these stories are we losing?
I mean, a lot, unfortunately, I think a lot. But that's it. Those are my stories. I mean, I'm grateful to you for listening to them, and I hope, people get something out of them. It's less, I had an amazing encounter in the forest with Sasquatch, and, my life changed. And it's more, actually, these really random things keep happening, and I just guess I wanted to share them.
No, me and the one-offs. I love the randoms and, the corroboration of things like the lion, this massive roar, and things like the water element coming back into another story where it's a lot of the same things that are repeatable. Science won't look at that as such, but we sure do. But no, Ed, thank you so much. And thank you for powering through such a long talk when you're still getting over COVID.
It's okay. You're lucky I've got COVID. You wouldn't be able to shut me up. So thank you. Thank you for listening.